My older sister made my life a living hell while my parents fiercely defended her every move. I left home at 16 with nothing but a single duffel bag and a broken heart. 12 years later, my mother called me crying hysterically, begging me to come to dinner because my sister desperately needed my help. When I arrived and heard the real reason they wanted to see me, I could not help but start laughing. They actually thought I would willingly go to federal prison to save the fragile white man my sister married. They were in for a shock. The VIP dining room at the most expensive steakhouse in Atlanta was suffocatingly quiet. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden light over the heavy mahogany table, but the atmosphere felt freezing cold. I stood in the doorway for a moment, just observing the people who had discarded me so easily all those years ago. My mother, Beatrice, sat wringing her hands together, her designer dress looking slightly wrinkled from obvious distress. Beside her sat my father, Desmond, his posture rigid as he tried to maintain his usual aura of church-ordained authority. Then there was my older sister named Jada. Jada looked perfectly polished on the outside, wearing a ridiculous amount of expensive jewelry that sparkled under the lights. But her eyes were red and swollen, and her hands trembled as she clutched a linen napkin. Sitting right next to her was Preston, her husband. Preston came from a family that constantly bragged about their old Southern wealth in Charleston. He was a wealth manager who always looked down his nose at me, making sure I knew my place as the uneducated black sheep of the family. I wore a tailored suit, but his usual arrogant smirk was completely gone. I walked slowly into the room, the heels of my shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. I took my seat directly across from Preston and Jada. I did not greet them with a warm hug. I did not ask my mother why she had been crying on the phone. I simply placed my purse on the empty chair next to me and signaled the waiter for a glass of sparkling water. The silence stretched out thick and heavy. My parents exchanged nervous glances, clearly waiting for someone else to speak first. Preston finally broke the heavy silence inside. He did not say hello. He did not ask how I was doing after 12 years of zero contact. Instead, he reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a massive stack of legal documents. The papers hit the table with a loud slap. He pushed the thick file across the polished mahogany until it stopped right in front of my plate. I looked down at the documents and then back up at his pale face. He pushed a silver pen toward me, his jaw clenched tight. "We need you to sign this immediately." "Aaliyah," he demanded, sounding incredibly desperate. I picked up my glass of sparkling water and took a slow sip, feeling the cool liquid soothe my throat. I did not touch the pen. I did not even look at the papers again. "Sign what exactly?" I asked, keeping my voice perfectly level and devoid of any emotion. Preston leaned forward, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. "I am under investigation by the FBI and the Securities and Exchange Commission." He muttered, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "They are looking into some massive wire fraud at my wealth management firm." My father Desmond cleared his throat, trying to sound commanding but failing miserably. "Your brother-in-law has run into a little bit of a misunderstanding with the federal government, Aaliyah. It is a highly sensitive corporate matter, and the family needs to stick together to protect our reputation in the community." I raised an eyebrow looking at my father. "A misunderstanding with the FBI and the SEC," I repeated slowly, letting the weight of those acronyms hang in the air. "That sounds like a very serious misunderstanding, Dad. What does any of this have to do with me today?" Preston swallowed hard, looking at Jada, before turning his desperate eyes back to me. 12 old. "When you were still living at home, we needed to set up a holding company for some specific investments. We used your social security number to list you as the primary director of the company. It was just supposed to be a temporary dummy corporation for tax purposes. But now the federal investigators have linked that specific shell company to the missing funds. On paper, you are the sole director of the entity that processed the fraudulent wire transfers they are tracking now." The sheer audacity of his words washed over me. I stared at him, mapping out exactly what he was confessing. "You stole my identity when I was a teenager," I stated clearly, ensuring there was no room for misinterpretation. "You committed identity theft using my social security number to create a fraudulent shell company, and then you used that company to hide the money you were stealing from your clients." Jada slammed her hand on the table. "We did not steal anything, you ungrateful brat," she hissed, her perfect facade cracking. "We were building wealth for this entire family unit." My mother. Beatrice suddenly burst into loud theatrical tears, grabbing her napkin to dab at her eyes. "Aaliyah, You have to understand how high the stakes are right now. Preston is the main provider for your sister. He is a respected wealth manager, and his family has an immaculate reputation in Charleston. If he goes to prison, Jada will lose everything. She will be ruined. We will all be ruined. The church community will never look at us the same way again. I looked at my mother, feeling absolutely nothing for her crocodile tears. I remained perfectly calm and silent. So, what exactly is in this stack of papers? I asked, nodding toward the heavy document. Preston leaned closer, his eyes darting around the room as if he expected federal agents to jump out from behind the curtains. It is a full written confession, he explained, his voice shaking slightly. It states that you acted alone as the director of the shell company and that you orchestrated the wire transfers without my knowledge. If you sign this taking full responsibility, the federal agents will drop their investigation into my main firm. You will take the fall for the family now? I let out a soft chuckle, shaking my head at the absolute delusion sitting across from me. You want me to sign a false confession, taking the blame for federal wire fraud? I asked, wanting to hear them confirm their madness. Beatrice reached across the table trying to grab my hand, but I quickly pulled it away. Please, Aaliyah, she begged, her voice trembling with manufactured panic. You are single. You have no real career to speak of. You have no children relying on you. You can easily bounce back from this minor setback in your life very quickly indeed. My mother continued her insane pleading, staring at me with wide, desperate eyes. If you take the pill, it will be minimum security. You will only be in prison for 3 years. 3 years is nothing, Aaliyah. You will be out before you know it. Preston will even put some money in your commissary account while you are in there. But Jada cannot survive without her husband. She has a perfect marriage and a beautiful home. You cannot destroy your sister's life just because you are bitter about the past. You have to do this for our family today. I looked at the 4 people sitting at the table. They genuinely believed I was the same broken, 6-year-old girl they had thrown out into the cold. They truly thought I was a desperate failure who would gladly sacrifice my own freedom to protect the sister who had always made my life miserable. I looked at Preston with his expensive suit and his profound arrogance, thinking his white privilege could force me into a prison cell. I looked at Jada, who sat there expecting me to fall on my sword for her. I started to smile very slowly. The smile grew into a soft laugh, and then I threw my head back and let out a genuine, full-throated laugh that echoed off the elegant walls of the private dining room. The sound of my laughter caught them completely off guard. My parents looked horrified. Jada looked insulted. Preston looked furious. I laughed until my sides hurt, wiping a single tear of pure amusement from the corner of my eye. I picked up my sparkling water and took another refreshing sip, savoring the moment while they stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind today. Do you honestly hear yourselves right now? I asked, my voice dripping with absolute coldness. You invite me here after 12 years of silence. You confess to stealing my identity when I was a minor. You confess to federal wire fraud, and then you have the nerve to ask me to spend 3 years in a federal penitentiary just to save the fragile white man my sister decided to marry. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and locked eyes with Preston. 3 years in federal prison to save your garbage company, Preston. I am truly flattered today. Jada gasped, her face contorting with rage. How dare you speak to my husband like that? She shrieked, her voice echoing loudly in the enclosed space. He is a highly educated wealth manager. He comes from a prominent family. You are nothing but a dropout who lives in some cheap apartment. You should be honored that we are even allowing you to help us. I looked at my older sister, feeling only profound pity for her immense stupidity. You are right, Jada, I said smoothly. He comes from a very prominent family, a family built on absolute lies and deceit. Preston slammed both of his fists onto the heavy wooden table, causing the fine china and crystal glasses to rattle violently. His face turned a deep shade of crimson, and the polite Southern gentleman facade completely vanished. What are you laughing at, you uneducated street rat? He snarled, pointing a shaking finger directly at my face. You think this is a joke? You think you have a choice here? If you do not pick up that pen and sign this confession right now, I will make sure you regret it for the rest of your miserable, pathetic life moving forward. I did not flinch. I did not blink. I stared right back at him, my expression completely unreadable. Preston leaned over the table, his voice dropping to a vicious, threatening growl. If you refuse to take this deal, I will use my family's blue blood lawyers to crush you. I will bury you under so much legal paperwork you will never see the light of day. I will ensure the federal prosecutors look at you as the sole mastermind, and I will use every ounce of my wealth and privilege to put you behind bars permanently. Sign the papers now." The room fell dead silent after his explosive threat. My parents sat frozen, too cowardly to intervene, while a grown man threatened their youngest daughter with total destruction. Jada smirked clearly, enjoying the display of power she thought her husband possessed. They were all waiting for me to break down crying and beg for mercy. They expected me to surrender to their intimidation just like I did when I was a child. Instead, I reached into my designer purse and pulled out my phone. They had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with today or what was coming next. I placed my phone face down on the smooth mahogany table and let his pathetic threat hang in the stifling air of the private dining room. Preston was breathing heavily, his chest heaving under his expensive tailored suit, as if intimidating a black woman was the most physical exertion he had engaged in all year. My parents sat completely frozen, perfectly willing to let this man threaten my freedom to protect their own comfortable lives. The silence stretched until it became physically uncomfortable for everyone in the room except me. My father, Desmond, finally decided to intervene. He adjusted his collar and puffed out his chest, putting on the booming, authoritative voice he usually reserved for Sunday morning church announcements. He pointed a stern finger at me across the table. "You will listen to your brother-in-law, Aaliyah," he commanded, his tone dripping with righteous indignation. "You do not have the moral high ground here. If this goes to a federal trial, I will personally stand on the witness stand and testify against your character. I will tell the judge exactly who you are and what you did. I will make sure the jury knows that you have a documented history of being a thief." I did not flinch. I slowly leaned back in my leather chair, crossing my legs and folding my hands in my lap. "And what exactly did I do, Dad?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and perfectly steady. "Please enlighten me. Remind everyone at this table about my terrible criminal past." My mother. Beatrice scoffed loudly, rolling her eyes as if my question was the most offensive thing she had heard all evening. "Do not play innocent with us." She snapped her manicured nails, tapping aggressively against the table. "We all remember what happened 12 years ago. You stole $10,000 from the church youth ministry fund. You broke into the pastor's office, took the cash, and hid the remaining money inside your mattress. You brought absolute shame to this family. We were humiliated in front of the entire congregation because of your greed and your deceit." Jada nodded along with my mother, a smug look of satisfaction washing over her tear-stained face. "You have always been a liar and a thief, Aaliyah," my sister added, her voice dripping with artificial superiority. "You have no integrity. That is why Preston and I had to use your information. We knew you would never amount to anything anyway, so we figured your identity was the perfect shield. You owe us for taking the fall. It is your way of repenting for what you did to our parents and to the church." I let them finish their coordinated attack. I let them build their entire argument on a foundation of self-righteous hypocrisy. Then I reached into my designer bag and pulled out a slim silver tablet. I set it on the table right next to the fraudulent confession papers Preston had given me. "You know, it is truly amazing what money can buy these days," I said, my voice smooth and conversational as I unlocked the screen. "For instance, money can buy top-tier data recovery specialists. It turns out that when a church deletes old security footage to cover up a scandal, the data is not actually gone forever. It just sits on outdated servers waiting for someone with enough resources to extract it." The color instantly drained from my father's face. Desmond swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his collar. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his booming voice suddenly losing all of its power. I turned the tablet around so the large screen faced the four of them. I pressed play and pushed the device to the center of the table. The footage was in black and white, slightly grainy from the old camera technology, but the audio and the visual details were undeniably clear. On the screen, a younger Jada was pacing inside the church administration office. She was 23 years old at the time, holding a massive stack of cash in one hand and her cell phone in the other. The audio recording captured her voice perfectly echoing through the quiet dining room of the steakhouse. "Yes, girl, I got the money." Jada's voice rang out from the tablet loud and clear. "I am booking the flight to Miami tonight. Doctor, Perez requires the deposit in cash for the procedure. No, nobody is going to notice it is missing until Monday. And even if they do, I will just stuff the leftover hundreds under Aaliyah's mattress." My parents always blame her for everything anyway. They will never suspect me. I need this surgery. I cannot be flat if I want to catch a wealthy husband. Jada lunged across the table, trying to grab the tablet, but I swiftly pulled it back out of her reach. She knocked over a crystal water glass in her panic, sending water spilling across the fraudulent legal documents Preston had prepared. "Turn that off," Jada shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "That is fake. You altered that video. You paid someone to fake my voice." I locked the screen and slipped the tablet back into my bag, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my sister. "We both know it is completely real." "Jada," I said, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper that cut through her hysteria. "That $10,000 paid for your cosmetic surgery in Miami. You bought your body with stolen church donations, and you framed your 16-year-old sister to keep your perfect reputation intact." I turned my gaze to my mother, whose face was now a mask of pure horror. "You did not even ask me if I did it," I said, staring directly into her soul. "You marched into my room, dragged me by my hair, and threw my only duffel bag into the snow. It was freezing that night. The wind was cutting through my thin jacket. I stood on the front porch crying and begging you to check the security cameras. I begged you to just look at the tapes. Do you remember what you told me, Mom?" Beatrice opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. Her hands were shaking violently as she stared at the spilled water soaking into the table. "You told me the cameras were conveniently broken," I continued, my voice rising with calculated precision. "You told me I was a filthy thief and a disgrace to the Black community. You slammed the heavy wooden door in my face, and I heard the deadbolt click into place. You changed the locks the very next morning while I was sleeping on a park bench trying not to freeze to death. You threw your own child into the streets to protect a sister who stole from God to buy herself a new body." Desmond tried to salvage the situation, trying to protect the fragile illusion of his respectable family. "Aaliyah, you have to understand the pressure we were under," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. The church board was furious. We had to protect the family image. Jada was already courting prominent men in the community. We could not let a scandal ruin her future. You were young and rebellious. We thought tough love would teach you a lesson. Tough love. I repeated the words, tasting bitter on my tongue. You call sacrificing one daughter to shield a thief tough love. You call letting Preston use my social security number to commit federal wire fraud family unity. You are not a family. You are a collection of parasites feeding off whatever you can manipulate. And now this video is going straight to the police as Exhibit A to prove a documented history of Jada framing me for her financial crimes. It establishes a perfect pattern of behavior for the federal prosecutors. Jada realized the walls were closing in on her. She saw that her tears and her victim routine were not working. So, she did what she always did when backed into a corner. She pivoted to arrogance. She straightened her posture, smoothed down her expensive silk dress, and lifted her chin, trying to project an aura of untouchable superiority. "Fine," she snapped her voice, trembling, but dripping with spite. "So, what if I took the money? That is in the past. It was over a decade ago. Look at me now, Aaliyah. I am a highly respected woman in Atlanta society. I sit on charity boards. I host galas. I have a perfect life and a perfect marriage." She reached over and grabbed Preston's arm, flaunting her wedding ring as if it were a shield that could protect her from the law. "My husband manages a $100 million fund." She bragged, her voice growing louder and more confident. "He is a genius in the financial world. We live in a gated community and we drive luxury cars. You are just trying to drag me down because you are miserable. You are jealous of the life I built while you were out there struggling on the streets. You want to ruin us because you could never achieve what we have." I let her finish her desperate flex. I watched her cling to the illusion of her wealthy white husband and her flawless social standing. I felt a slow, cold smile spread across my face. I looked at Jada and then I shifted my gaze to Preston, who was currently hyperventilating. His skin was pale, and he looked like he was about to vomit right there on the fine dining table. "Are you absolutely sure it is a $100 million fund?" "Jada," I asked, my tone conversational, but laced with deadly implication. Jada glared at me. "Of course, I am sure. Preston is the top asset manager at his firm. He controls portfolios for the wealthiest families in the state." I smiled even wider, leaning forward just a fraction. "That is fascinating," I whispered, keeping my eyes locked on Preston, who was actively avoiding my gaze. "Tell me something, Jada." Since your husband is such a financial genius, and since your life is so incredibly perfect, have you bothered to check his bank accounts this morning? The heavy silence in the private dining room was broken only by the sound of my mother's ragged breathing as she processed her total financial ruin. Elaine had spent her entire adult life worshipping at the altar of social status and church prestige. She had sacrificed me to protect Jada because Jada was her golden ticket to country club dinners and bragging rights. Now that golden ticket had expired and left her with absolutely nothing, but the sheer survival instinct of a deeply selfish woman is a terrifying thing to witness. Her tears stopped almost as quickly as they had started. She slowly lifted her head from the mahogany table and looked at me. Her eyes were red and her expensive makeup was smeared across her cheeks, but a new desperate calculating light flickered in her gaze. She realized that while Preston was completely broke and Jada was utterly ruined, there was one person left in the room who clearly possessed immense power and unlimited resources. My mother scrambled out of her heavy leather chair and practically threw herself across the space between us. She reached out and grabbed my hand with an iron grip, her manicured nails digging painfully into my skin. I did not pull away immediately. I simply looked down at her desperate, grasping fingers, feeling a profound sense of disgust wash over me. "Aaliyah," she gasped, her voice and pleading. "Aaliyah, you have to listen to me right now. You have money and you have an assistant, and you obviously have access to private investigators. You clearly have powerful corporate lawyers working for you in the shadows. You have to help us, Aaliyah. You have to help your family right now before we lose everything we have worked so hard to build over the last 30 years. I raised an eyebrow, staring at her tear-streaked face. I asked her exactly what kind of help she was expecting from the daughter she had thrown out into the snow 12 years ago. Elaine cried harder, nodding frantically, as if my question was an invitation to negotiate our relationship. "You have to hire your lawyers to sue Preston," she demanded, her voice growing louder and more frantic. "We have to take him to federal court and get our retirement money back. We have to freeze whatever offshore assets he has left before his mistresses spend it all on designer handbags and luxury vacations. You can easily pay for the legal fees, Aaliyah. You can save us from living on the streets. We are your blood and we are your family. You cannot just sit there and let your own mother and father starve while you sip sparkling water in a fancy restaurant." I gently but firmly peeled her fingers off my hand, pushing her arm back toward her side. I asked her what would happen if I simply declined to pay for her high-risk lawyers. I asked her why I should spend a single dime to rescue the people who had gladly watched me take the blame for a felony I did not commit. My father, Desmond, finally found his voice. He stood up, leaning heavily on the table, looking at me with a sickening mixture of desperation and his old familiar entitlement. "You have to help us, Aaliyah," he demanded, his voice shaking with anger and fear. "If you do not pay for the lawyers to get our money back from Preston, we have no other choice. We will have to sell your grandmother's house." The mention of my grandmother's house made the air in the private dining room drop another 10 degrees. My grandmother was the only person in this entire family who had ever shown me an ounce of genuine love and basic human respect. She was the one who bought me my first computer when I was a little girl. She was the one who encouraged me to learn to code and build software when my parents told me I was wasting my time on worthless hobbies. She was the one who hugged me when my parents ignored my existence to praise Jada for her superficial accomplishments. She had left her beautiful historic home in Atlanta to my parents when she passed away with the strict understanding that it would remain in the family forever as a sanctuary. "We still have the deed to that property," Desmond continued, seeing that the mention of the house had caught my undivided attention. "It is fully paid off, and it is the only asset we have left that Preston did not manage to steal from us. If you do not fund our legal battle against your brother-in-law, we will put the house on the real estate market tomorrow morning. We will sell it to the highest corporate bidder to cover our immediate living expenses and our legal fees. You always loved your grandmother more than anyone else in the world. You always loved spending time in that house, reading her books, and sitting on her porch. You cannot possibly stand by and let us sell her legacy to strangers just to survive our current financial crisis." They were doing it again. They were using the only pure thing I had ever cared about as a hostage to force me into saving them from their own profound stupidity. They had just lost their entire life savings to a white con artist, and their immediate instinct was to emotionally blackmail their youngest daughter into bailing them out. The sheer, unadulterated toxicity of my parents was truly a marvel to witness. They had absolutely no moral bottom. They would sell the memory of the woman who raised them just to maintain their fake affluent lifestyle for a few more months in their prestigious church community. I let out a slow, deep sigh, shaking my head in pure disbelief at the monsters sitting across from me. "You really never learn, do you, Dad?" I said, standing up slowly from my leather dining chair. I straightened my posture, looking down at my parents, who were staring up at me with desperate, calculating eyes. "You always think you have one last card to play in your hand. You always think you have some hidden leverage over me to force me back into my place as the family scapegoat." I reached for the buttons of my expensive designer coat. I unbuttoned the front and slowly slid the heavy wool fabric off my shoulders, handing it silently to Elijah, who folded it meticulously over his arm. Underneath the winter coat, I wore a tailored black blazer cut from flawless Italian silk. Pinned to my left lapel, catching the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers, was a small, elegant diamond pin. It was shaped into a sharp, distinct geometric logo. The letters A and C were intertwined perfectly in a crest that commanded immediate respect in the financial districts of the East Coast. I watched Preston's eyes widen as he recognized the corporate logo from his pathetic place on the dining room floor. He stopped breathing entirely, his jaw dropping open in sheer, unadulterated terror as his brain processed exactly what that diamond pin represented in his world of wealth management. "Who exactly do you plan to sell grandmother's house to, Dad?" I asked, taking a slow, deliberate step closer to Desmond. "Do you plan to list it on the open residential market hoping for a quick cash buyer? Do you plan to sell it to a commercial real estate developer who will tear it down to build luxury condos? Or do you plan to sell it to a massive private equity firm?" Desmond's brow furrowed in deep confusion. He did not recognize the name of the firm, and he did not understand the corporate dynamics at play. "It does not matter who we sell it to," he stammered, taking a nervous step backward as I approached him. "We will sell it to absolutely anyone who has the cash to buy it outright and save us from bankruptcy." I reached into the inner pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a heavy gold foil-stamped business card. I tossed it onto the mahogany table, letting it land directly on top of the fraudulent confession papers they had tried to force me to sign just 30 minutes earlier. "You cannot sell grandmother's house to Apex Capital, Dad," I said, my voice echoing with absolute freezing authority. "Because Apex Capital already owns it." Elaine looked down at the gleaming business card and then looked back up at me, her eyes wide with uncomprehending shock. She read the bold black letters printed across the thick cardstock. "What are you talking about?" She whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of Jada's quiet sobbing from the corner of the room. "I am talking about the fact that you do not own anything anymore," I declared, looking around the room at my ruined, shattered family. "I am the founder and the chief executive officer of Apex Capital. I am the private equity firm that bought all of Preston's toxic corporate debt when his wealth management fund collapsed under the weight of his own greedy mismanagement. I am the firm that purchased his foreclosed ancestral estate in Charleston at a private banking auction last week. And when you put grandmother's historic house up as collateral for a short-term bridge loan 3 months ago to help Preston cover his early margin calls, I bought that specific debt too." I watched the blood drain completely from my father's face as the reality of his terrible financial decisions finally caught up to him. He had secretly leveraged the only piece of genuine family history they had left to save a son-in-law who was simultaneously stealing from them and cheating on their favorite daughter. I legally transferred the deed of grandmother's house into my private personal heritage trust 30 days ago. I continued driving the final nail into their coffin. "It is completely protected as a designated heritage site, and it is solely in my name. You cannot sell it to pay for your lawyers, because it does not belong to you and it never will again." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the polished table, commanding the entire space with a physical presence they could never hope to match. "I do not work for anyone. I do not answer to anyone. I am not the struggling college dropout you created in your twisted minds to feel better about your own miserable lives. I am the owner of the private equity firm that just systematically dismantled your entire existence piece by piece. I am the master of this board. I am your boss. I am your landlord. I am your owner." The room was so quiet. I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning unit running above us. Jada was staring at me from the floor, her mouth hanging open as she realized the little sister she had tormented and framed for theft was now a corporate titan who controlled her entire future. Elaine collapsed back into her chair, unable to support her own weight anymore as the full scope of my power crashed down upon her shoulders. Desmond looked like he was about to have a heart attack, his hands clutching his chest as he processed the fact that he was completely at my mercy. But the most satisfying reaction came from Preston, the arrogant white wealth manager who had tried to intimidate me with his Southern heritage and his blue blood lawyers was now trembling so violently his teeth were actually chattering. He slowly pushed himself up into a kneeling position, his torn custom suit making him look like a defeated beggar. He stared at the diamond lapel pin on my blazer, his eyes wide with a horrific realization. He finally connected the dots between his sudden catastrophic downfall and the young black woman standing above him. His voice was a pathetic broken wee when he finally managed to speak. "You," he gasped, pointing a shaking finger at the gold foil business card resting on the table. "You are the anonymous corporate creditor. You are the one who bought out my institutional creditors and initiated the massive margin calls that bankrupted my firm overnight. You are the one who locked me out of my own corporate accounts. You are the anonymous creditor who handed over my unredacted financial books to the Federal Bureau of Investigation this morning." I looked down at Preston and offered him the coldest, most unforgiving smile of my entire life. I tilted my head slightly, letting him drown in the absolute certainty of his own destruction. I told him that he was entirely correct. I was the one who handed him over to the federal agents, and I was the one who was going to make sure he never saw the outside of a prison cell again. The reality of my words hit Preston with the physical force of a freight train crashing into his chest. The arrogant wealth manager who had spent the last hour threatening to destroy my life, with his blue blood lawyers, was completely gone. In his place was a terrified, cornered animal. Realizing the trap had already snapped shut around his neck, he stared up at me, his chest heaving, his expensive custom suit torn and rumpled from where Jada had attacked him earlier. The heavy silence in the private dining room stretched out, magnifying his absolute humiliation. He looked at his wife, Jada, who was still sitting on the floor. Her makeup ruined her designer dress, stained with spilled wine. He looked at my parents, who were paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of their financial ruin. And then he looked back at the diamond pin on my lapel, the symbol of the private equity firm that now owned his entire existence. Preston slowly shifted his weight on the expensive restaurant rug. He did not try to stand up and face me like a man. Instead, he moved his knees carefully until he was positioned directly in front of my chair. The wealthy white man who had always used his race and his family heritage to make me feel small was willingly dropping to his knees. At my feet, he clasped his hands together, holding them up toward my chest in a pathetic gesture of submission. "Aaliyah, please," he begged, his voice cracking completely stripped of its usual Southern drawl and arrogant confidence. "Aaliyah, you have to call off the federal agents. You have to tell Apex Capital to withdraw the corporate complaint from the Securities and Exchange Commission. You own the debt, so you have the power to stop this. I will do whatever you want me to do. I will sign over everything I have left. I will work for you for free. You cannot let them send me to federal prison. Guys like me do not survive in a place like that. My family name will be permanently destroyed. My parents just lost their estate in Charleston because of me. They cannot handle their son going to a federal penitentiary. Please, I am begging you as your brother-in-law. Have some mercy on me." I looked down at his trembling hands and felt a slow, cold wave of satisfaction wash through my veins. I did not feel an ounce of pity for him. "You wanted me to take a 3-year sentence in minimum security just an hour ago, Preston?" I reminded him, my voice perfectly level and quiet. "You told me 3 years was nothing. You told me I would be out before I knew it, and you would kindly put some money in my commissary account. Why do you not take your own advice now? It is just federal prison, Preston. You will bounce back very quickly indeed." Preston let out a desperate choking sob, shaking his head frantically. "No, you do not understand," he gasped, sweat dripping down his forehead and stinging his eyes. "They are looking at 20 years. Aaliyah, the wire fraud, the embezzlement, the identity theft. It carries a 20-year mandatory minimum sentence. I cannot do 20 years. I will not survive it. I will give you anything you want. I know you hate me, and I know I treated you terribly, but I can give you the one thing you really want today." I leaned back in my leather chair, resting my hands in my lap. "And what exactly do you think I want, Preston?" I asked, keeping my tone conversational. Preston swallowed hard, glancing nervously over his shoulder at Jada before turning his desperate eyes back to me. He lowered his voice, leaning closer to my knees. "I can give you Jada," he whispered, his words rushing out in a frantic, desperate stream. "I will divorce her tomorrow morning. I will sign the papers right now, but more importantly, I will be your star witness, Aaliyah. I will tell the federal prosecutors everything they need to know to put her away instead of me. I will testify under oath that Jada was the mastermind behind the identity theft. I will tell them she was the one who stole your social security card 12 years ago because she lived in the same house as you. I will swear that she forged your signature on the corporate documents because her handwriting is a closer match to yours. I will hand over all her emails and text messages. I will tell the feds she spent the stolen money on luxury cars and jewelry. I will give you her head on a silver platter. Aaliyah, just please spare me and let me walk away from this. The room erupted into absolute chaos. The second the words left his mouth, Jada let out a sound that was not entirely human, a guttural screech of pure agonizing betrayal, the illusion of her perfect marriage, the wealthy white knight who had elevated her social status. The man she had worripped and lied for had just offered to sell her to the federal government to save his own skin. "You lying, cowardly piece of garbage," Jada screamed, scrambling off the floor and launching herself at Preston's back. She slammed her fists into his shoulders, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his neck. "How dare you?" she shrieked hysterically, tearing at his hair. "I lied for you. I stole for you. I convinced my own parents to give you their retirement fund because you told me we needed bridge capital to secure our lifestyle. I let you set up that shell company in my sister's name because you promised me we would be billionaires by the time I was 30, and now you want to throw me in prison. I am your wife, you pathetic loser." Preston shoved her backward hard enough that she stumbled and fell against the base of the mahogany table. He scrambled to his feet, his face twisted with a vicious, ugly rage that completely erased his refined gentleman facade. "You were never my wife, Jada." He spat down at her, wiping blood from a scratch on his cheek. "You were a convenient accessory. You were a desperate, status-obsessed social climber who turned a blind eye to every illegal wire transfer as long as I kept your closet full of designer bags and kept your country club memberships active. Do not act like some innocent victim. Now you hated your sister just as much as I did. You were the one who suggested we use her social security number because you said she was a nobody who would never amount to anything anyway. You said she was a disposable asset. My mother." Elaine let out a horrified gasp, covering her mouth with her hands. She stared at Jada and Preston as if she was looking at two strangers. "You knew?" Elaine whispered, her voice trembling with shock and devastation. "Jada, you knew he was stealing from us. You knew he was taking our retirement money, and you knew he stole your sister's identity." Jada looked at our mother, her face pale and stree with dark mascara. "Mom, I had to," Jada pleaded, crawling toward Hila's chair. "He told me the firm was just facing a temporary liquidity crisis. He promised he would pay your retirement money back with massive interest. I was trying to protect our family image. Mom, you always told me image was the most important thing you told me. A successful husband was the only thing that mattered in our community. I was just doing what you taught me to do." My father, Desmond, finally snapped, his deep-seated pride and his fragile ego completely shattered by the humiliation unfolding before him. He stood up and pointed a trembling finger at Preston. "You are a disgrace to your family name," Desmond boomed, trying to summon the old church authority he used to wield over me. "You took advantage of our trust. We welcomed you into our home. We treated you like a son. We elevated you in our community. And you repay us by bankrupting us and trying to send my daughters to federal prison. Stand up like a man and face the consequences of your actions, you cowardly thief." Preston turned his vicious glare toward my father, letting out a cruel, mocking laugh. "Your community," Preston sneered, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated racism and classism. "Do you really think I gave a single damn about your church community? Desmond, you and your wife were nothing but easy marks. You were so desperate to have a white wealth manager as a son-in-law, so you could brag to your pathetic friends that you practically threw your life savings at my feet without asking a single question about my portfolio. Strategy. You are a foolish, arrogant old man who cared more about looking rich than actually being smart. You sold out your own youngest daughter because you were too busy kissing my shoes. Do not stand there and try to lecture me about morality. You hypocritical failure." Desmond's chest heaved as Preston's words struck him with lethal precision. The truth was an absolute poison, and my father was drinking it straight from the source. He stumbled backward, clutching his chest, sinking heavily into his chair as the reality of his own vanity crushed the last remaining breath from his lungs. He had sacrificed me, his own flesh and blood, to protect a monster who secretly despised him for the color of his skin and the desperation of his social climbing. I sat perfectly still, watching the glorious destruction of the family that had abused me for my entire life. I did not need to raise my voice. I did not need to scream or cry or throw things. I simply watched them tear each other apart like wild rabid animals trapped in a cage of their own making. The elegant private dining room was entirely trashed. Wine glasses were shattered across the floor. The heavy mahogany table was covered in spilled water and scattered documents, and the 4 people who had walked in expecting to ruin my life were now emotionally, financially, and legally bankrupt. Preston realized that engaging with my father was a waste of time. He turned his attention back to me, dropping to his knees once again, his hands clasped together in desperate supplication. "Aaliyah, please," he begged, ignoring the chaos happening behind him. "I will give you everything. I will sign the divorce papers. I will write out the full confession, naming Jada as the primary conspirator. I will testify that your parents were fully aware of the financial mismanagement. I will give you whatever you want. Just tell your corporate lawyers to back off. Tell Apex Capital to withdraw the complaint. You have the power to show mercy today." I looked at him. My expression is cold and unyielding as a solid block of ice. "Mercy?" I repeated, the word feeling foreign in the context of this room. "You did not show me mercy when you planned to send me to a federal penitentiary for 3 years. Preston, you did not show my parents mercy when you spent their retirement fund on blonde Instagram models in Macau. You do not want mercy. You just want to escape the consequences of your own breathtaking arrogance. And the answer is absolutely not. My lawyers have already filed the paperwork. The evidence is in the hands of the federal authorities, and there is nothing you can do to stop the avalanche that is coming for you." Preston stared at me, the last glimmer of hope dying completely in his eyes. He slumped backward, sitting heavily eyes, his head drooping toward his chest, as he finally accepted that his life was entirely over. The ancestral Charleston estate was gone. His wealth management firm was gone. His freedom was gone. He was just a criminal waiting for the handcuffs to click around his wrists. Jada watched her husband surrender to his fate, and the final thread of her own sanity snapped completely the perfect golden child. The woman who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself realized that her white knight was dead and her parents were broke. She had no money, no home, no status, and a looming federal indictment with her name written all over it. She slowly pushed herself up off the floor, but she did not stand. She stayed on her hands and knees, her expensive designer dress dragging through the spilled wine and broken glass. She crawled across the distance, separating us, her movements jerky and desperate. My mother, Elaine, let out a quiet sob, watching her perfect daughter reduced to a crawling beggar on the floor of a steakhouse. Jada reached my chair and grabbed the fabric of my trousers, her hands shaking violently. "Aaliyah," she wept, looking up at me with a face so ruined by terror and tears that I barely recognized her. "I am your sister. We share the same blood. We grew up in the same house. I know I treated you terribly, and I know I was a monster to you, but you cannot let me go to prison. You cannot let Preston throw me under the bus. I will be completely homeless tomorrow morning. I have absolutely nothing left. You are a billionaire. Aaliyah, you own an entire private equity firm. You have more money than you could ever spend in a lifetime. Just give me $1 million. Just give me $1 million to hire a divorce lawyer and start over somewhere new. I will disappear and you will never have to see my face ever again. Please, Aaliyah, you have to save me from this nightmare." I looked down at my older sister, who was currently groveling on the floor of the private dining room, her hands still desperately clutching the fabric of my tailored silk trousers. Jada was weeping so hysterically that her entire body was shaking her perfectly styled hair now, a tangled mess around her tear-stained face. She had just witnessed her wealthy white husband offer to trade her freedom for his own, and her immediate response was to crawl to the very sister she had abused and framed for a felony 12 years ago. She actually believed that her tears, and her sudden desperate pleas for sisterhood, would somehow erase a lifetime of calculated cruelty. She honestly thought that because I had built a billion-dollar private equity firm, I would simply hand over $1 million to rescue her from the wreckage of her own pathetic life. The sheer, breathtaking entitlement of her request hung in the air of the ruined restaurant, mixing with the smell of spilled wine and roasted meat. I did not move my legs. I did not reach down to help her up. I just stared at the top of her ruined head, letting her feel the absolute coldness of my presence. You are asking me for $1 million. Jada, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, but carrying so much authority that it cut straight through her pathetic sobbing. You are sitting on the floor begging me for $1 million, so you can hire a divorce lawyer and run away from the criminal charges you helped create. You are begging the sister you threw to the wolves for a financial bailout. Jada looked up at me, her eyes wide and bloodshot, her chest heaving as she struggled to catch her breath. Yes, she gasped, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks and dripping onto the expensive rug. Please, Aaliyah, I have nothing left. Preston is going to destroy me to save himself. You have more money than you could ever spend. $1 million is nothing to you now. It is just pocket change for a CEO. Please, I am your sister. We share the same blood. You have to save me. I slowly reached down and firmly peeled her shaking fingers off my trousers, smoothing out the silk fabric where she had wrinkled it. I took a deliberate step back, forcing her to remain kneeling on the empty floor without anything to hold on to. I tilted my head, studying her ruined face as a very specific memory from 12 years ago rose to the surface of my mind. It was a memory I had used as fuel during every sleepless night I spent teaching myself how to code. It was the memory that kept me warm when I was sleeping in bus stations and eating out of vending machines. Do you remember the night Mom and Dad threw me out of the house? Jada, I asked, keeping my tone perfectly conversational as if we were discussing the weather, rather than the most traumatic night of my entire life. Do you remember that freezing night in January after you stole the $10,000 from the church youth fund and shoved the leftover cash under my mattress to frame me? Jada swallowed hard, her eyes darting nervously toward our parents, who were still sitting in paralyzed silence at the dining table. That was a long time ago, she stammered, her voice weak and defensive. We were just kids, Aaliyah. I made a mistake. We were not just kids. I corrected her, my voice dropping an octave and turning to absolute ice. I was 16 years old. You were 23. You were a grown woman who sacrificed a teenager just so you could fly to Miami and buy yourself a new body to trap a wealthy husband. But that is not even the part that I remember the most, Jada. The part I remember the most is what happened after Mom threw my duffel bag into the snow and locked the front door. I watched Jada's face drain of whatever little color it had left. She knew exactly what memory I was pulling from the dark archives of our family history. It was snowing that night. I continued painting the picture for everyone in the room to hear. The wind was howling, and my jacket was so thin I could feel the ice biting into my bones. I was sitting on the frozen concrete of the front porch, crying and shivering, trying to figure out how I was going to survive the night. And then you pulled into the driveway. You had just come back from a late dinner with your friends. You parked your car, and you walked up the driveway wrapped in that thick, expensive wool coat Mom had bought for your birthday. You looked so warm and so perfectly content with the life you had just stolen from me. Elaine let out a quiet whimper from the table, finally understanding the true depth of the horror she had enabled. But I ignored her entirely, keeping my focus locked on my sister who was shrinking backward on the floor. I walked up to you on the driveway. Jada, I said, my words hitting her like physical blows. I was shivering so violently my teeth were chattering. I did not ask you to tell Mom the truth. I did not ask you to confess to the church. I knew you were too much of a coward for that. I just looked at you and I begged you for $20. I asked you for a single $20 bill so I could buy a ticket for the Greyhound bus and ride it to a friend's house across town so I would not freeze to death on the streets of Atlanta. $20, Jada. That was the entire value of my life to you in that moment. Jada covered her face with her hands, letting out a long, agonizing wail of shame. But I was not going to let her hide from the truth. I stepped closer, forcing her to hear every single word. Do you remember what you did when your 6-year-old sister begged you for $20 to escape the freezing cold? I demanded, my voice finally rising, filling the corners of the private dining room with decades of suppressed rage. You looked at me with absolute disgust. You hawked a wad of saliva from your throat, and you spat directly onto my cheap canvas sneakers. And then you looked me dead in the eyes and you told me to drop dead because I was ruining your good mood. You walked inside the warm house, and you left me out there to die in the snow. The silence that followed my words was completely suffocating. Preston was still cowering against the wall, staring at his wife as if he was finally seeing the true monster he had married. Elaine was quietly weeping into her hands, the crushing weight of her parental failure. breaking her spirit entirely. Desmond sat rigidly, his face gray with shock, unable to process the sheer cruelty that had taken place right outside his own front door while he was sleeping comfortably in his bed. "You are begging me for $1 million today, Jada," I said, my voice dropping back to a lethal, calm whisper. "You think because you are crying on the floor of a luxury steakhouse, I am supposed to forget the night you spat on my shoes and told me to drop dead." I slowly unclasped my designer handbag and reached my hand inside. The rich leather of the bag felt cool against my fingers as I bypassed my credit cards and my corporate keys. I reached into a small zippered compartment where I always kept a tiny amount of emergency cash. I pulled my hand out, holding a single, slightly crumpled green $20 bill. It was such a small, insignificant piece of paper in the grand scheme of my current wealth, but in this room, it carried the weight of an absolute death sentence. I held the $20 bill up to the light, letting Jada see exactly what it was. Her red, swollen eyes locked onto the green paper, and a fresh wave of horrified tears spilled down her cheeks as she realized what I was about to do. "I am not going to give you $1 million, Jada," I told her, my voice echoing with pure, unfiltered satisfaction. "But I am a woman of my word, and I believe in settling old debts." I flicked my wrist and threw the crumpled $20 bill directly at her face. The small piece of paper fluttered through the air between us, drifting down slowly until it hit her wet cheek and dropped onto the stained rug right next to her trembling hands. "I am returning the favor," I said, looking down at her broken, pathetic form with interest. Jada stared at the $20 bill on the floor and then let out a devastating scream of total defeat. She collapsed entirely, burying her face into the ruined carpet, sobbing uncontrollably as the final realization hit her. She was not going to get a dime from me. She was going to face the federal prosecutors completely alone, and she was going to lose absolutely everything. Her life was officially over, and she had no one to blame but herself. Suddenly, the sound of a heavy chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor shattered the moment. Desmond had finally reached his breaking point. My father pushed himself up from the dining table, his large frame shaking with a mixture of profound embarrassment and misdirected masculine rage. His ego could not handle the fact that his patriarchal authority had been completely dismantled by the daughter he had thrown away. He could not accept that his family hierarchy was destroyed and that his precious golden child was currently sobbing over a $20 bill on the floor. Desmond slammed his fist on the table, pointing a rigid finger at me, his face contorted with desperation. "That is enough, Aaliyah," he roared, trying to summon the booming barone voice he used to command his church congregation. "You have made your point. You have humiliated your sister, and you have broken your mother. But you are going too far. This is not how Black families handle their business." I turned away from Jada and looked at my father, raising an eyebrow at his sudden attempt to weaponize our race and our culture to defend his own toxic behavior. "We stick together," Desmond shouted, his chest heaving as he tried to regain control of the narrative. "The world out there is already hard enough for us. We have white men like Preston trying to steal from us and tear us down. But we do not destroy our own blood. We protect our community. You are acting like a traitor to your own people, Aaliyah. You come in here with your corporate money and your fancy private equity firm and you use it to crush your own family. What do you think the church is going to say about this? What do you think the community is going to say when they find out you sent your own sister to federal prison and let your parents go bankrupt? You are ruining our respected name in the church. You are disgracing us before God and before the entire congregation." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate guilt trip wash over me without absorbing a single drop of it. It was the classic final defense of a toxic parent. When they can no longer control you with fear, they try to control you with guilt. And when personal guilt fails, they try to use the weight of the entire community to force you back into submission. Desmond truly believed that invoking the sacred name of his church and the reputation of our family would somehow shame me into dropping the corporate complaints and saving them all. I let out a dry, hollow laugh, shaking my head at his absolute hypocrisy. "The church?" I asked, my voice cutting through his loud breathing like a freshly sharpened blade. "You are standing there lecturing me about family unity and community reputation, and you actually have the nerve to bring up the church." Desmond puffed out his chest, his eyes blazing with defensive pride. "I have been a deacon at that church for 25 years, he declared. "I have built a reputation of honor and integrity. You have no right to question my standing in the community." I took a slow, deliberate step toward the dining table, closing the distance between us until I was standing just a few feet away from my father. I looked deep into his eyes, watching the false pride mask, the deep-seated cowardice underneath. "Do you honestly think I care about your fake prestige in a building full of hypocrites, Dad?" I asked, keeping my tone dangerously low and perfectly precise. "Do you think because I left Atlanta 12 years ago, I stopped paying attention to the people who ruined my life? I run a private equity firm, Desmond. My entire business model is built on investigating, finding hidden assets, and exposing financial fraud. It is literally what I do for a living every single day." Desmond's posture faltered slightly, a brief flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. He glanced at Preston, who was still cowering on the floor, and then looked back at me, his breathing suddenly growing shallow. "What are you talking about?" he stammered, his booming voice losing a fraction of its volume. "I am talking about the sacred church, Dad," I replied, leaning forward slightly to ensure he heard every single word. "I am talking about the community reputation you value more than the life of your own daughter. Do you really think I do not know what you and the pastor have been doing with the congregation's donation fund for the last 4 years?" The silence in the room became so absolute that I could hear the steady ticking of the expensive grandfather clock out in the hallway of the restaurant. Desmond stared at me, his jaw slack, his eyes wide with a terror that went far deeper than simple financial ruin. This was the terror of a man who had built his entire identity on the perception of absolute moral superiority, and was now staring directly at the person holding the sledgehammer over his glass house. For my entire life, Desmond had used his position as a senior deacon at the Fellowship Church to dictate how everyone else should live. He had stood at the pulpit on Sunday mornings, wearing his custom-tailored suits, preaching about integrity and family values, and the consequences of sin. He had used those exact same sermons to justify throwing me out onto the street when I was 16 years old, claiming that my presence was a corrupting influence on his pristine household. He had allowed the entire congregation to believe that I was a lost cause, a rebellious child who had broken her parents' hearts, while he and Elaine bravely carried on as pillars of the community. I kept my eyes locked on him, watching the remaining color drain from his face until his skin took on a sickly gray pall. "What is the matter, Dad?" I asked, my voice smooth and perfectly steady. "You were just yelling so loudly about community reputation and church standing a moment ago. You were just lecturing me about how Black families need to stick together and protect each other from the outside world. Why are you suddenly so quiet when I bring up the donation fund?" Desmond swallowed hard, his hands trembling as he reached out to grip the back of a dining chair for support. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a weak, raspy whisper that sounded nothing like the booming patriarch he pretended to be. "Charma, you do not know what you are talking about," he stammered, looking around the room as if hoping the walls would somehow swallow him whole. "The church finances are completely transparent. The pastor and I have a fiduciary duty to the congregation. We manage the building fund and the charity outreach programs with the utmost respect for the Lord's money. You are making baseless accusations because you are angry about the past." I let out a soft laugh, shaking my head at his pathetic attempt to gaslight me one last time. I did not look away from him as I raised my right hand slightly. Elijah stepped forward immediately, opening his leather briefcase and pulling out a sleek silver tablet. He handed it to me and stepped back into the shadows, blending seamlessly into the background while I pulled up the files I had been compiling for the last 3 months. I tapped the screen, bringing up a heavily documented spreadsheet, and turned the tablet around so Desmond could see the bright, glowing screen. "I am a private equity CEO, Desmond," I reminded him, my tone stripped of any familial warmth. "My entire career is built on conducting forensic financial audits. I buy companies that are failing and I find out exactly where the money is leaking. Do you really think a local church ledger is difficult for my team to crack? Do you honestly believe that your fake shell companies and your offshore routing numbers were sophisticated enough to hide your theft from a team of corporate investigators who do this for a living?" Desmond stared at the screen, his eyes tracking the highlighted rows of transactions and bank routing numbers. His knees buckled slightly, and he had to lean his entire body weight against the chair to keep from collapsing onto the floor next to Preston. "Let us review the transparency of your fiduciary duty, Dad," I said, reading off the screen with ruthless precision. 3 years ago, the church raised $150,000 for the Youth Community Center renovation project. The congregation held bake sales and charity drives, and elderly women gave their limited Social Security money to help build a safe space for the kids in the neighborhood. According to these bank records, you and the pastor awarded the renovation contract to a company called Pinnacle Contracting Services. You paid them the full $150,000. The only problem is that Pinnacle Contracting Services does not actually exist. It is a dummy corporation registered to a post office box in Delaware, and the primary signatory on the corporate bank account is you. Elaine let out a sharp gasp, covering her mouth with both hands as she stared at her husband. Desmond closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly as if trying to wake up from a nightmare. But it gets better. I continued swiping to the next page of the forensic audit. You did not just steal from the youth fund. Last year, the church collected $75,000 for the Thanksgiving Family Relief Program to feed low-income households during the holidays. The audit trail shows that $50,000 of that money was diverted into an administrative expense account that you personally control. And purely by coincidence, 3 days after that transfer cleared, Elaine walked into the Sunday service wearing a brand new diamond tennis necklace that cost exactly $48,000. Jada looked up from the floor where she was still crying over the crumpled $20 bill. She stared at our mother, her expression shifting from absolute misery to horrified realization. You bought your jewelry with money meant for starving families, Jada whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the revelation. You sat in the front pew judging everyone else while wearing stolen charity money around your neck. Elaine grabbed the diamond necklace resting against her collarbone as if the stones had suddenly turned to hot coals burning her skin. She yanked her hand away, her chest heaving as she struggled to pull oxygen into her lungs. Charmaine, that is not true, Elaine cried out, stepping away from Desmond. I did not know where the money came from. He told me he got a bonus from his consulting work. I would never steal from the church. I am the president of the women's ministry. I am a woman of God. You are a parasite, Elaine. I corrected her coldly. You are a shallow, empty woman who cared more about looking wealthy than actually being honest. You did not care where the money came from as long as it kept you at the top of the social ladder. You let Desmond drive a luxury sedan leased under a tax-exempt church account while you paraded around in stolen diamonds playing the role of the perfect Christian matriarch. You two are the most repulsive hypocrites I have ever encountered in my entire life, and you make me absolutely sick to my stomach. Desmond found a sudden burst of frantic, desperate energy. He lunged toward the table, reaching out to try and grab the tablet from my hands. You cannot show this to anyone. Charmaine, he pleaded, his voice dropping, his eyes wild with terror. You cannot release this information. It will destroy the church. It will destroy the pastor. It will ruin the community. You are touching the Lord's anointed. You are bringing scandal to the house of God. If you do this, you are no better than the criminals you hunt down in your corporate buyouts. I easily stepped back out of his reach, keeping the tablet securely in my hands. Do not you dare try to use religion to manipulate your way out of grand larceny. Desmond, I snapped, my voice echoing off the walls with lethal authority. God does not drive a stolen Mercedes, and God does not ask elderly widows to fund your wife's jewelry collection. You destroyed your own reputation the second you decided to steal from the very people who trusted you to lead them. You built your entire life on a foundation of absolute fraud, and now the bill has finally come due. I tapped the screen, navigating away from the spreadsheet and opening my secure email application. I had drafted the message earlier that morning, waiting for the perfect moment to deliver the final killing blow to the family that had tried to destroy me. I turned the screen back toward my father, so he could see the email draft loaded with dozens of attached PDF files containing the complete forensic audit, the bank routing numbers, the fake invoices, and the photographic evidence of their lavish spending. Look at the recipient list, Dad, I commanded, pointing to the top of the screen. Desmond squinted at the glowing tablet, his entire body trembling violently as he read the email addresses listed in the blind carbon copy field. He read the names of the other deacons, the church elders, the choir director, the head of the financial committee, and the influential community leaders who formed the backbone of his social circle. He read the email addresses for the local Atlanta news stations, the investigative journalism teams, and the regional newspaper editors. And finally, he saw the email addresses for the Criminal Investigation Division of the Internal Revenue Service and the local district attorney's office. Charmaine, pleased, Desmond begged, tears finally spilling over his eyelids and running down his face. He was crying real tears now, mourning the absolute death of his pristine public image. I am your father. I gave you life. I put a roof over your head when you were a child, "You cannot send this email. If you send this, they will excommunicate me. They will arrest me. I will go to prison for embezzlement. I am too old to go to prison, Charmaine. I will not survive it. I will lose all my friends. I will be a total pariah in the city of Atlanta. Please, I am begging you on my knees. Do not press that button." I looked at the man who had stood by and watched his wife throw me out into the snow. I looked at the man who had gladly offered to testify against my character in a federal court just an hour ago to protect his white son-in-law. I looked at the man who had spent 12 years pretending I was dead so he would not have to explain why his youngest daughter had run away from his toxic, abusive household. "You stopped being my father the night you changed the locks on the front door." I told him, my voice completely devoid of mercy or hesitation. I looked down at the tablet, and I firmly pressed the send button. The screen flashed, confirming that the email had been successfully delivered to over 200 recipients simultaneously. The truth was officially out in the world. The forensic evidence was sitting in the inboxes of every single person Desmond and Elaine had ever tried to impress. The authorities had everything they needed to secure indictments for embezzlement, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The fake prestige that my parents had valued over the life and safety of their own daughter was instantly and permanently obliterated. "It is done," I announced, slipping the tablet back into my purse. "The audit is in their hands. By tomorrow morning, your faces will be on the local news. By tomorrow afternoon, the church board will vote to excommunicate you and strip you of all your titles. And by the end of the week, the financial authorities will freeze every single bank account you have left to recover the stolen charity funds. You are going to lose your freedom, and you are going to spend the rest of your miserable lives knowing that everyone in the city sees you exactly for what you are, a pair of common, greedy thieves." The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Desmond let out a raw, agonizing cry of total defeat, his legs giving out completely. He collapsed onto his knees next to the dining table, joining Preston on the floor in a pathetic display of ruined, arrogant men. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly as he pictured the inevitable humiliation of being led out of his house in handcuffs while his neighbors watched. Elaine was staring straight ahead, her eyes wide and unblinking, her mouth slightly open as she struggled to pull air into her lungs. The realization that she was wearing stolen diamonds. The realization that her country club friends were currently reading an email proving she was a fraud. The realization that she was going to be completely penniless and facing criminal charges was simply too much for her fragile, narcissistic brain to process. She raised her hands to her chest, clutching the fabric of her expensive designer dress. As her breathing became incredibly rapid and shallow, she started to hyperventilate her face, turning a terrifying shade of red as her blood pressure skyrocketed to dangerous levels. Desmond Elaine gasped, her voice high-pitched and wheezing. "Desmond, my chest hurts. I cannot breathe. My chest is tight." Jada scrambled up from her spot on the floor, abandoning her ruined $20 bill to rush over to our mother. "Mom," she cried, grabbing Elaine's shaking shoulders. "Mom, look at me. Calm down. You are having a panic attack. Breathe. Mom, just breathe." But Elaine could not breathe. The absolute destruction of her social standing was a literal physical blow to her heart. She let out a sharp, choked gasp, her eyes rolling back slightly as her knees buckled. Jada screamed, trying to hold her up, but Elaine's dead weight was too heavy. My mother collapsed hard onto the carpeted floor of the private dining room, clutching her chest and gasping for air as her body shut down under the sheer magnitude of her own catastrophic failure. Desmond did not even move to help his wife. He just stayed on his knees, rocking back and forth, lost in his own personal nightmare of public disgrace and impending prison time. Preston was still curled against the wall, completely broken and unresponsive. Jada was kneeling over our mother, screaming for someone to call an ambulance, her perfect life reduced to absolute ashes in less than an hour. I stood perfectly still in the center of the wreckage, watching the four of them writhe on the floor of the luxurious steakhouse. I did not reach for my phone to call for help. I did not offer any words of comfort. I just observed the beautiful, poetic justice of a toxic, abusive family finally reaping exactly what they had sown for decades. They had built a fortress of lies, and I had simply removed the cornerstone and watched it all collapse into dust. And then, breaking through the sound of Jada's hysterical screaming and Elaine's desperate gasping for air, I heard it. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, echoing through the busy streets of downtown Atlanta. The sound grew steadily louder and more aggressive, piercing through the thick glass windows of the restaurant. The long, relentless howling of multiple police sirens approaching the building at high speed. I turned my head slightly, looking out through the large, decorative windows of the private dining room that faced the front parking lot of the steakhouse. The dark evening sky was suddenly shattered by intense flashing lights. Violent strobes of brilliant red and harsh bright blue bounced off the brick exterior of the restaurant, cutting through the dim romantic lighting of the dining room and illuminating the faces of my ruined family on the floor. The authorities had arrived far faster than even I had anticipated. Responding to the massive corporate fraud reports my team had submitted earlier in the day and the embezzlement evidence I had just unleashed. The FBI and the local police were here to collect the trash. The heavy double doors of the private dining room were not simply opened. They were violently thrown apart. The loud crash of solid wood hitting the plaster walls echoed like a gunshot over the sound of my mother's desperate gasping. Half a dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear poured into the elegant space. They moved with practiced military precision, their heavy boots completely ignoring the spilled wine and the shattered crystals scattered across the expensive restaurant rug. The sudden invasion of armed law enforcement instantly shattered whatever remaining illusions of grandeur my family had been clinging to. The lead agent, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a stern expression, held up a gold badge that caught the flashing red and blue lights from outside. He did not ask for permission to enter the room. He commanded the space instantly, his eyes scanning the chaotic scene before locking directly onto the pathetic man cowering against the far wall. Preston let out a sound that I can only describe as a dying animal. It was a high-pitched, breathless whimper of absolute terror. The arrogant Southern gentleman, who had spent the entire evening bragging about his blue blood heritage, and his elite lawyers suddenly looked like a terrified child. His eyes darted toward the swinging doors that led to the restaurant kitchen, his body visibly shaking as the reality of his situation crashed down upon him. Preston, the lead agent, announced, his voice booming with undeniable authority. "We have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged with multiple counts of wire fraud securities, fraud, money laundering, and aggravated identity theft. Place your hands where I can see them and step away from the wall." My father, Desmond, let out a loud, agonizing groan, burying his face deeper into the carpet. The respected church deacon was currently watching his prized, wealthy son-in-law being read his rights by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. All of his bragging at the country club, all of his arrogant sermons about family success were entirely incinerated in front of his eyes. But the federal agent was not finished. He did not step forward to cuff Preston immediately. Instead, he turned his cold, calculating gaze toward my older sister. Jada was still sitting on the floor. Her designer dress ruined her makeup smeared across her tear-stained face. She was looking at the agents with wide, uncomprehending eyes, clearly believing that her status as a wealthy housewife would somehow shield her from the consequences of her husband's actions. Jada, the agent, continued pulling a second folded document from his jacket pocket. "We also have a federal warrant for your arrest. You are being charged as a primary co-conspirator in a federal racketeering scheme. You are facing multiple counts of tax evasion, conspiracy to commit wire fraud, and knowingly receiving and distributing illicit funds." The words hit Jada like a physical blow to the chest. She recoiled violently, her mouth dropping open in sheer horror. The golden child who had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate her own social status was suddenly being treated like a common criminal. "No," Jada shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. "No, you are making a mistake. I am just his wife. I do not know anything about his business. I do not work at his firm. I just stay home and plan charity galas. You cannot arrest me. I am a respected member of the community. I have nothing to do with any of this." She pointed a shaking finger at Preston, who was still frozen against the wall. "He is the wealth manager," Jada cried desperately, trying to throw the man she loved under the bus just to save her own skin. "He did everything. He managed all the accounts. I never saw any of the paperwork. You cannot send me to jail for his crimes." The federal agent did not show a single ounce of pity for her theatrical display. "Mom, your signature is physically present on over 40 fraudulent tax returns," he stated coldly, reading from his file. "Your name is listed as a primary beneficiary on multiple offshore shell company banking documents. You personally authorized wire transfers using funds that were stolen from elderly clients. You are a legally registered co-conspirator, and you are coming with us today." Jada realized that her tears and her victim routine were completely useless against federal evidence. She saw that her white knight could not protect her, and her parents were too broken to intervene. She started hyperventilating her hands, clawing at the carpet as the absolute certainty of a federal prison sentence loomed over her perfect life. Preston saw that the agents were temporarily focused on securing Jada. His cowardly survival instinct kicked into overdrive. He looked at the distance between himself and the federal agents, and then he looked at the swinging doors leading to the restaurant kitchen. The arrogant man who had threatened to bury me under endless legal paperwork decided to run like a desperate street thief. He scrambled off his knees, his expensive leather shoes slipping wildly on the wet rug. He let out a frantic, desperate yell and bolted toward the back exit, shoving a dining chair out of his way. He actually thought he could outrun a federal indictment. He actually believed he could escape the consequences of his breathtaking greed. Earlier in the evening, a quiet, unassuming waiter had been pouring our vintage wine and serving our dry-aged steaks. He had stood silently in the corner of the room, observing the entire confrontation without making a single sound. He was currently standing near the kitchen doors, holding a silver serving tray in his hands. As Preston sprinted toward the exit, the waiter did not panic. He simply dropped the silver tray. The heavy metal clattered loudly against the hardwood floor. The waiter stepped perfectly into Preston's path, blocking the exit with his body. Preston tried to shove past him, but the waiter was incredibly fast. He grabbed the lapels of Preston's torn custom suit and executed a flawless tactical takedown. The waiter swept Preston's legs completely out from under him. Preston's feet flew up into the air, and the waiter slammed him face first into the solid hardwood floor with bone-crushing force. The impact knocked the wind entirely out of Preston, leaving him gasping and choking for air. The waiter immediately dropped his knee into the center of Preston's back, pinning him firmly to the ground. The waiter reached into his apron and pulled out a gold badge and a heavy pair of steel handcuffs. He was not a restaurant employee. He was an undercover federal agent planted by my security team to ensure that Preston did not try to destroy any evidence or flee the scene before the raid officially began. "Stop resisting," the undercover agent commanded, pulling Preston's arms roughly behind his back. The sound of the steel handcuffs clicking tightly around Preston's wrists was the most beautiful symphony I had ever heard in my entire life. It was the sound of absolute, undeniable justice. Preston was sobbing openly now, his face pressed flat against the dirty restaurant floor. He was crying like a helpless child, begging the undercover agent to let him go. "Please," Preston wailed, tears and saliva pooling on the hardwood. "Please let me call my father. You do not understand who my family is. You cannot do this to me. I will give you whatever you want. Just let me call my lawyers." The white privilege that had shielded him from consequences. His entire life was completely useless now. His money was gone. His ancestral estate was gone. His firm was bankrupt. He was just another criminal crying on the floor, waiting to be processed into the federal justice system. Jada watched her husband get dragged up from the floor by his collar, his hands securely cuffed behind his back. The reality of her situation finally broke whatever remaining sanity she possessed. The golden child lost her mind completely. She started crawling across the ruined carpet toward our mother. Mom Jada screamed, her voice raw and hysterical. "Mom, you have to do something. You have to call the church lawyers. You have to call the mayor. You have to call someone to stop this nightmare. They are going to take me to prison. Mom, they are going to lock me in a cell. You have to save me. You always save me. Mom, please do not let them take me away." My mother, Elaine, was still sitting slumped in her dining chair, her chest heaving as she struggled to breathe through her panic attack. She watched her golden child screaming and begging on the floor. She looked at the heavily armed federal agents securing the perimeter of the room. And then she looked at my cold, unyielding face. Elaine realized in that exact moment that nobody was coming to save them. The church community she loved so much was currently reading an email proving she was a fraud. Her social reputation was entirely incinerated. Her retirement money was completely gone. The fake prestige she had valued over her own daughter's life was nothing but ashes. Elaine looked down at Jada, who was clutching at her mother's knees and weeping violently. But Elaine did not see a daughter in need of comfort. She did not see a child begging for maternal protection. Elaine's survival instinct flared up in the most disgusting and repulsive way imaginable. As Jada cried, Elaine saw the massive diamond tennis necklace glittering brilliantly around Jada's neck. It was the $48,000 necklace that Preston had bought using the stolen charity funds from the church. It was the only piece of liquid wealth left in the entire room. Elaine dropped to her knees next to her hysterical daughter. She did not hug Jada. She did not stroke her hair or offer her any words of comfort. Instead, Elaine reached out with trembling, greedy fingers and aggressively grabbed the back of Jada's neck. She desperately started trying to unsip the heavy diamond necklace from her own daughter's throat. Jada recoiled in shock, swatting at her mother's hands. "Mom, what are you doing?" Jada cried, trying to pull away. "Give it to me." Ella hissed, her eyes wild with pure, selfish panic as she clawed at the diamond clasp. "Give me the necklace, Jada. They are going to take everything we have. I need to hide it in my purse so I can sell it to a pawn shop tomorrow. I need cash to survive. Give me the diamonds right now, you stupid girl." She was literally trying to rob her own daughter, while federal agents were reading her rights. It was the ultimate display of the toxic, parasitic nature that defined my parents. They would gladly strip the jewelry off their own children to save themselves from inconvenience. But before Elaine could successfully undo the complicated clasp, a woman in a sharp gray suit stepped forward from the line of federal agents. She moved with quiet authority, her eyes locked entirely on my mother's desperate, greedy hands. The woman reached down and firmly grabbed Elaine's wrist, her grip tight enough to stop my mother dead in her tracks. The woman looked down at Elaine with an expression of profound disgust. She pulled a leather credential wallet from her suit jacket and flipped it open, revealing an official government badge. She identified herself clearly over the sound of the blaring sirens outside. She was an agent for the Internal Revenue Service. The sharp gray suit of the Internal Revenue Service agent stood in stark contrast to the ruined luxury of the private dining room. She held my mother's wrist with a grip like a steel vice. Beatrice froze her eyes wide with unadulterated terror as the federal agent calmly but firmly instructed her to release the diamond clasp. The agent explained in a voice entirely devoid of emotion that the jewelry was purchased using funds directly traced to a massive wire fraud and embezzlement scheme. Under federal law, all assets acquired through these illicit transactions were subject to immediate civil asset forfeit. The agent stared directly into my mother's panicked eyes and stated that attempting to tamper with federal evidence was the felony, and if Beatrice did not step back immediately, she would be joining her daughter in handcuffs. Beatrice gasped, dropping the heavy diamond necklace as if the stones had suddenly turned to burning coals. The priceless piece of jewelry clattered against Jada's collarbone before slipping down onto the stained rug. The IRS agent did not miss a single beat. She signaled to another agent who stepped forward holding thick, clear plastic evidence bags. The federal authorities did not treat Jada like a wealthy, socialite, or a respected member of the community anymore. They treated her exactly like the criminal she had chosen to become. An agent firmly grasped Jada's shaking hands and began systematically stripping the rings off her fingers. The platinum engagement ring, the massive diamond wedding band, the designer, tennis bracelets she flaunted at her exclusive country club brunches. All of it was meticulously removed, cataloged, and dropped into the evidence bags. Jada sobbed uncontrollably, her voice breaking as she begged them to at least let her keep her wedding ring. The agents ignored her pleas entirely, working with cold mechanical efficiency. Preston was subjected to the same humiliating treatment across the room. The undercover agent who had tackled him to the floor roughly pulled the heavy gold Rolex off Preston's wrist. The expensive luxury watch he had bought after stealing the church donation funds was bagged and tagged as federal evidence right in front of his eyes. Every symbol of their fake wealth, every shiny object they had used to make themselves feel superior to me, was being stripped away and locked in plastic baggies. But the physical stripping of their wealth inside the room was only the beginning of their nightmare. The blaring sirens outside shifted in pitch, mixing with the loud, grinding gears of heavy machinery. Through the large decorative windows of the private dining room, the violent flashing red and blue lights illuminated a new arrival in the restaurant parking lot. It was a massive heavy-duty tow truck backing perfectly into the reserved VIP parking space directly in front of the building. Jada let out a guttural, agonizing shriek as she followed my gaze out the window. Parked proudly in that space was her pristine white Mercedes wagon. It was her ultimate status symbol. The vehicle she drove through our old neighborhood just to make the neighbors jealous. The car she constantly posted on her social media to prove she had made it to the very top of the social ladder. Now, a rough-looking man wearing a neon reflective vest was dragging heavy steel chains across the wet pavement. He ducked under the front bumper of the $100,000 luxury SUV and secured the towing hooks to the frame. Jada thrashed wildly against the federal agents holding her, screaming at the top of her lungs that they could not take her car. She claimed hysterically that it was leased entirely in her name and had absolutely nothing to do with Preston's wealth management firm. The IRS agent calmly pulled a silver tablet from her leather folder and read off the vehicle identification number. She looked at Jada and explained that the massive down payment for the vehicle and the last 14 monthly lease payments were made from an offshore shell account tied directly to her husband's fraudulent transfers. The agent stated that the vehicle was officially seized by the federal government to recover the stolen funds. The hydraulic lift of the tow truck winded loudly, cutting through the noise of the rain outside as it hoisted the front wheels of the luxury SUV off the ground. Jada collapsed completely, going entirely limp in the arms of the arresting officers. Her entire identity was so deeply tied to her material possessions and her perceived social status that watching her beloved car get towed away shattered her fragile mind completely. She hung her head and wept the tears, smearing her expensive makeup, turning her face into a tragic mask of total defeat. My parents were completely paralyzed watching the absolute destruction of their golden child. Beatrice was leaning heavily against the wall, taking shallow, panicked breaths as she clutched her chest. Desmond was staring blindly at the floor, a broken, empty shell of the booming, arrogant patriarch he had been just hours ago. But the consequences of their profound greed and endless toxicity were not finished with them yet. A local Atlanta police officer who had escorted the federal team into the building stepped forward from the hallway. He walked directly toward my father, his heavy black boots crushing the broken crystal wine glasses scattered across the dining room rug. "Desmond Wilson," the officer asked, holding a thick brown manila envelope in his hand. My father could only nod his vocal cords, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of the moment. The officer handed him the envelope and stated clearly that he was serving official legal notice of a property foreclosure and a 4-hour residential eviction mandate. Desmond stared at the brown envelope as if it were a venomous snake about to strike him. His hands shook violently as he tore the top open and pulled out the thick stack of legal documents inside. He read the bold black letters printed across the top of the first page, and his knees instantly buckled. He had to grab the edge of the heavy mahogany dining table just to keep from collapsing onto the floor next to the spilled wine. "What is it?" Beatrice whimpered, her voice barely a raspy, terrified whisper. Desmond could not speak, his jaw moving silently as he stared at the foreclosure notice. I decided to translate the corporate legal jargon for them. I stepped closer to the table, my tailored silk blazer catching the ambient light from the crystal chandeliers overhead. I reminded them that Preston had taken out a massive bridge loan to cover his failing investments a few months ago when his wealth management firm first started bleeding cash. I reminded them that they had willingly co-signed that high-interest loan using their primary residence as collateral because they were so absolutely desperate to maintain the illusion of their wealthy, perfect son-in-law. When Apex Capital bought out Preston's toxic debt portfolio, we acquired all the collateral attached to it. I explained, my voice perfectly smooth and completely unyielding. You defaulted on the terms of that loan the exact moment Preston was locked out of his frozen corporate accounts this morning. My legal team filed the foreclosure paperwork at the county courthouse hours ago. Your house does not belong to you anymore, Dad. It belongs to Apex Capital, and as the founder and chief executive officer of the firm, I have decided to evict the current tenants immediately. You have exactly 24 hours to pack whatever cheap clothes you have left and vacate my property. If you are still inside the house tomorrow evening, the county sheriff's department will arrive to physically remove you for trespassing. The absolute finality of my words crashed over them like a freezing tidal wave. In less than 10 minutes, every single material possession they worshipped had been systematically stripped away. Preston's firm was entirely gone. Jada's expensive jewelry and luxury cars were seized by the federal government. The historic ancestral home they tried to use as leverage against me earlier was safely locked inside my private heritage trust. And now the large suburban house they had lived in for 20 years was foreclosed and legally owned by the very daughter they threw out into the snow. They were completely destitute. They had no savings left, no retirement accounts to draw from, no home to return to, and no social standing in their community. They were worse than bankrupt because they also carried the heavy public shame of being exposed as thieves and frauds to their entire church congregation. Every illusion they had built their lives upon was shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces. The federal agents began moving their prisoners toward the door to begin the booking process. Preston was crying silently, His head hung low in absolute shame as he was marched out of the room, his hands securely cuffed behind his back. The arrogant Southern gentleman was officially dead, replaced by a broken federal inmate. Jada was sobbing, hysterically, dragging her feet across the carpet as two agents half-carried her toward the exit, her ruined designer dress trailing behind her. My parents stood trembling in the corner left behind because they were not part of the federal wire fraud indictment yet, but they both knew their local embezzlement charges would be coming very soon. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence as the heavy doors closed behind the federal agents. The quiet was broken only by the flashing lights reflecting from the parking lot and my parents' ragged, uneven breathing. I stood calmly adjusting the cuffs of my silk blazer, feeling an incredible sense of deep, abiding peace wash over my soul. The board had been completely cleared. My revenge was absolute and utterly flawless. They had nothing left to use against me and nothing left to hide behind. But the universe has a wonderful sense of poetic irony, and the final blow of the evening did not come from me or the federal agents or the local police. The heavy wooden doors of the private dining room creaked open slowly, breaking the tense silence. Stepping hesitantly into the wreckage of the room was the general manager of the steakhouse. He was a tall, thin man wearing a pristine fitted tuxedo, but his face was incredibly pale as he took in the sight of the shattered glasses, the spilled water, the ruined carpet, and the sheer devastation lingering in the air. He clearly did not want to interrupt the aftermath of a massive federal raid, but he also had a luxury business to run and protocols to follow. He swallowed hard, clutching a sleek black leather folio tightly in his hands. His eyes darted nervously around the room before looking at me and then looking at my parents shivering in the corner. "Excuse me." The manager stammered, his voice incredibly polite but vibrating with extreme nervousness. "I apologize for the terrible interruption to your evening, but our corporate policy requires that all private dining tabs be settled in full before the party vacates the premises." He walked slowly over to the mahogany table, stepping carefully to avoid the broken glass, and gently placed the leather folio directly in front of Desmond. The folio fell open naturally, revealing the long itemized receipt for the evening. I detailed every single extravagant choice they had made when they thought they were celebrating my ruin. The dry-aged Wagyu steaks, the imported caviar appetizers, the expensive truffle side dishes, and the 3 bottles of extremely rare vintage French wine that Jada had arrogantly ordered to toast what she thought would be my ultimate downfall. The grand total printed at the bottom of the receipt in bold black ink was $4,500. The manager took a respectful step back, pulling a heavy silver pen from his jacket pocket and offering it forward. "How would you like to settle the bill tonight, sir?" he asked politely, waiting for a credit card. I watched my father stare at the simple piece of black leather resting on the mahogany table as if it were a loaded weapon ready to fire. Desmond Wilson, the man who had spent his entire life measuring his worth by the size of his bank account and the prestige of his social circle, was completely paralyzed by a $4,500 restaurant tab. He looked down at the itemized receipt detailing the vintage French wine and the dry-aged Wagyu beef that his golden child had so arrogantly ordered to celebrate my supposed destruction. His hands shook violently, his fingers hovering over the paper, but refusing to touch it. He had no cash. His offshore accounts were frozen by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. His domestic accounts were locked by my corporate lawyers. His credit cards would decline the moment the manager swiped them. He was a senior church deacon, a pillar of the community, and he was sitting on the floor of a luxury steakhouse, completely incapable of paying for the food in his stomach. The restaurant manager shifted uncomfortably, sensing the profound humiliation radiating from the ruined family. He looked at Beatrice, who was still gasping for air in the corner, and then at Jada, who was weeping hysterically as the federal agent secured the plastic evidence bags containing her seized diamonds. The manager cleared his throat, opening his mouth to ask for payment again, but I did not let him speak. I slowly reached into my tailored silk blazer and withdrew a sleek, heavy piece of black anodized titanium. It was an American Express Centurion card, a financial instrument available by invitation only reserved exclusively for the absolute highest tier of global wealth. The metallic clink it made when I dropped it onto the silver tray echoed through the silent room like a final judge banging a gavel. "Put the entire balance on my account," I instructed the manager, keeping my voice perfectly calm and devoid of any emotion, "and add a $10,000 gratuity for the waiting staff. They have provided exceptional service this evening, and they have had to clean up a rather pathetic mess." The manager's eyes widened fractionally as he looked at the heavy black card and processed the sheer magnitude of the tip. A $10,000 gratuity was more than my parents used to make in 2 months. He bowed his head in deep professional reverence, entirely ignoring the sobbing family on the floor. "Right away, madam," he whispered, picking up the silver tray with the utmost respect. "Thank you for your incredible generosity." As the manager stepped backward and slipped out of the private dining room, I stood up from my chair. I smoothed the front of my blazer and buttoned it with slow, deliberate precision. Every single movement I made was designed to convey absolute, untouchable power. I looked down at the 4 people who had conspired to send me to a federal penitentiary just 2 hours ago. They were completely unrecognizable now. The arrogance, the entitlement, the fake Southern charm, and the religious hypocrisy had been entirely stripped away, leaving nothing but raw, panicked desperation. Preston was kneeling by the wall, his hands cuffed tightly behind his back, his custom suit torn and ruined. His face was pressed against the expensive rug, his chest heaving as he sobbed like a terrified child, knowing he was going to spend the best years of his life in a federal cell. Jada, my beautiful, perfect older sister, the golden child who had spat on my shoes when I begged for bus money, was curled in a fetal position. Her designer makeup was running down her face in dark, ugly streaks. Her neck bare where her stolen diamonds had rested just moments before. She had no husband, no home, no car, and a massive federal indictment waiting for her. My mother, Beatrice, was clutching her chest, still hyperventilating her eyes, darting frantically around the room, as if waiting for a miracle to save her social reputation. But the email containing the forensic audit of her stolen church funds was already in the inbox of every single person she cared about. She would never sit in the front pew again. She would never attend another country club luncheon. She was a pariah, and Desmond, my father, was simply broken. His jaw hung open, his eyes, vacant, staring at the foreclosure notice the police officer had handed him. The patriarch had fallen, and his entire kingdom was reduced to ash. I stepped away from the table, my expensive heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor surrounding the rug. I walked slowly, pacing the perimeter of their destruction, forcing them to feel my presence looming over them. For 12 years, I have carried the memory of the freezing snow on the front porch, I said, my voice ringing through the room with crystal clarity. I have remembered the sound of the deadbolt locking behind me when you threw a 16-year-old girl out into the dark to protect yourselves. You sold out the only daughter who ever genuinely loved you to protect a gold-plated illusion. You sacrificed my future to buy yourselves a few more years of fake prestige and arrogant pride. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of my parents, looking down into their terrified eyes. You thought wealth was about wearing stolen diamonds and leasing luxury cars with embezzled money. You thought power was about quoting scripture to intimidate your congregation while secretly draining their charity funds. But you never understood what real power is. Real power does not need to boast. Real power does not need to steal. Real power simply waits for the perfect moment to strike. My father let out a weak, pathetic whimper, reaching a trembling hand out toward my shoes. "Please," he choked out, his voice completely broken. "You have made your point. We are sorry. We are so sorry. Please do not leave us like this. We have nothing. We have absolutely nowhere to go." I looked down at his reaching hand, and I felt absolutely nothing. No pity, no blums. No lingering childhood desire for his approval. The emotional cord that had tied me to these toxic parasites was permanently severed. "Now the gold has melted," I told them, delivering the final killing blow to their illusions. "And you have absolutely nothing left." I did not wait for their response. I turned my back on them, and I walked away. I did not look over my shoulder as I crossed the private dining room. I did not flinch when Jada let out another blood-curdling scream as the federal agents grabbed her by her ruined dress and hauled her to her feet. I did not hesitate as I pushed through the heavy wooden double doors and stepped out into the main dining area of the restaurant. The atmosphere in the main restaurant was completely silent. The wealthy patrons had stopped eating their expensive steaks and were staring in absolute shock at the massive police presence swarming the building. But as I walked through the tables following the path toward the front exit, they parted for me like the Red Sea. They saw the diamond apex capital pin on my lapel, They saw the freezing, untouchable authority in my posture. They instinctively knew that I was the architect of the destruction happening in the back room, and they moved out of my way with terrified respect. Aaliyah fell into step slightly behind my right shoulder, a silent shadow protecting my flank. He pushed open the heavy glass front doors of the steakhouse, and the cool, crisp night air of downtown Atlanta hit my face. It smelled like rain and exhaust fumes in absolute perfect freedom. The parking lot was a sea of chaotic flashing lights. Half a dozen local police cruisers and unmarked federal SUVs were parked haphazardly across the pavement, their violent red and blue strobes illuminating the dark brick exterior of the building. Parked perfectly at the edge of the chaos, completely untouched and pristine, was my custom matte black Maybach. Elig stepped forward and opened the heavy armored rear door of the luxury vehicle, waiting silently for me to enter. I stepped inside, sinking into the impossibly soft cream leather interior. The cabin was completely soundproof, instantly muting the loud blaring sirens and the shouting of the police officers outside. It was a private sanctuary of extreme wealth and security. Elijah closed the door behind me and slipped into the driver's seat, starting the massive engine with a barely audible purr. He did not ask for directions. He knew exactly where we were going. As the Maybach slowly pulled away from the curb, gliding smoothly past the line of police vehicles, I turned my head and looked out the tinted rear window. The federal agents were dragging Preston and Jada out through the front doors of the restaurant. Preston was stumbling over his own feet, his head ducked down to hide his crying face from the crowd of onlookers who had gathered on the sidewalk with their cell phones out. Jada was fighting against the agent, screaming hysterically as the cold handcuffs dug into her wrists. Her beautiful designer dress was stained with wine and dirt, her fake perfect life completely broadcast for the entire city to witness. An agent firmly placed a hand on her head and shoved her roughly into the back of a squad car, slamming the door shut and trapping her in the dark. Just behind them, stumbling out of the restaurant like a pair of the Walking Dead, were my parents. They were not in handcuffs yet, but their local arrest warrants were already being drafted. They stumbled down the concrete steps, holding on to each other for balance. Desmond looked incredibly old and frail, his shoulders slumped, his chest hollow. Beatrice was shaking violently, clutching her arms around herself to ward off the cold night air. They had no car because it had been seized and towed. They had no house to return to because I had foreclosed on it and legally ordered an immediate eviction. They had no money to call a taxi. I watched in the rearview mirror as my mother and father sank down onto the wet concrete curb of the restaurant parking lot. They sat there in the flashing red and blue lights, shivering and weeping openly, completely ruined and entirely alone. The congregation they had stolen from would never forgive them. The country club friends they had tried to impress would pretend they never knew them. The golden child they had worshipped was sitting in the back of a police cruiser. They were finally experiencing the exact same cold, terrifying isolation they had forced upon me 12 years ago. The Maybach turned the corner, leaving the flashing lights and the shattered remnants of my abusive family far behind in the darkness. I leaned back against the plush headrest and let out a long, slow breath. The tension I had carried in my shoulders for more than a decade finally melted away, completely evaporating into the luxurious atmosphere of the car. I reached out and opened the chilled compartment built into the center console. I retrieved a crystal flute and a bottle of vintage Dom Perignon that Elijah always kept perfectly iced for moments of celebration. The cork popped with a soft, elegant sigh. I poured the golden bubbling liquid into the crystal glass, watching the carbonation rise to the surface. I lifted the glass to my lips and took a slow, deliberate sip. The champagne was crisp cold and tasted absolutely incredible. I turned my gaze to the front windshield, looking out at the glittering skyline of the city. Soaring above the other buildings, dominating the financial district with its sleek glass architecture and glowing illuminated logo, was the Apex Capitol Tower. It was my building, my firm, my empire. I had built it with my own two hands, working through sleepless nights and endless struggles, fueled by the very rejection my family had tried to use to destroy me. They had tried to bury me in the snow, but they did not realize I was a seed. I had taken their hatred, their abuse, and their betrayal, and I had weaponized it, turning myself into a corporate titan who controlled billions of dollars in private equity. I had returned to their world, not as a victim begging for scraps, but as an apex predator claiming my rightful place at the absolute top of the food chain. I took another sip of the champagne, letting the cool liquid wash over my tongue as the Maybach glided smoothly toward my penthouse. I had no regrets. I had no lingering guilt. I had executed the perfect, flawless dismantling of the people who had tried to ruin me. I had seized their illusions. I had exposed their lies, and I had taken back my power. I was completely free, and it was without a doubt the sweetest revenge I had ever tasted. The story of Aaliyah teaches us that true power and self-worth never come from the validation of a toxic family, but from internal resilience and the courage to build your own legacy. When those who should protect you choose their greed and superficial status over your well-being, walking away is not a failure. It is the ultimate victory. Success built on authenticity and relentless hard work becomes an unshakable fortress. Ultimately, the most profound revenge is simply reclaiming your independence, establishing unyielding boundaries, and refusing to be diminished by people who never truly valued your intrinsic human worth and dignity. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic environment to find your own strength, share your journey of resilience in the comments below.